Okay, well, thanks a lot, everybody, for joining us. I'm really excited to do this. Hope it goes well. It's going to be probably the longest presentation I've done in my life so far. Well, thank you for the introduction. As Tony mentioned, I've experience with SMART in a previous kind of spatial monitoring tool called MIST. Most of all in the Russian Far East, where I introduced it to 7 protected areas, but also to a wildlife management agency that works outside protected areas, and also did projects in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan and Afghanistan. Presently have a project for the protection of forests using SMART in Ukraine, and hopefully in the near future I'll also work in Kyrgyzstan and Georgia. So basically, it's a kind of a mixture of experience. Not all of things I'm going to say will be focused on snow leopards. So there are many topics that I would like to cover in this session. So that there's a lot of ground, lots of things that I would like to share with you. First of all, I want to talk a little bit, explain a little bit of what my focus will be in this talk and the perspective. I will focus on using SMART for protection, for patrol management. So not so much on biological monitoring, which is a topic that will be covered in the next session. My perspective will be management. I will not go into any technical details, will not show how the smart computer tool works. It's all about how to organize a project for the introduction of SMART. And there is going to be very little actually that is specific for snow leopards. A little bit, but basically I, in general terms, talk about the steps to introduce SMART. And those steps don't really differ whether you're trying to protect saiga antelopes in a desert or a steppe or snow leopards in the mountains. And the perspective will be that of a person or a team that has to be SMART. So either somebody who has been assigned or somebody who him or herself decided to do this. So basically the perspective is if you're going to introduce SMART at the site or at an organization working outside protected areas, how should you set up such a process? And there are, of course, different situations that you can be in. For instance, below situation 3 is the not so favorable situation that we have in Russia, where there's just one NGO, WCS, Wildlife Conservation Society, who took the initiative to start introducing SMART to protected areas with Amur tigers, Siberian tigers. So basically, we took the initiative. There's unfortunately no, and it is probably quite uncommon, no involvement at all from the ministry, from the central agency. They know that we're using SMART, they're not against it, but they do nothing to support the process. There are actually also not no local NGOs or communities involved. So much more favorable would be a situation like situation 2. So if you're in a situation where you could involve local NGOs and the central agency and communities, I think you should always try to do so and form a team that leads the introduction of SMART together and try to create some local capacity for doing this, for taking over at a certain point at the sites where you're working, but also to create a capacity for expanding to new sites and eventually do that without support from international NGOs like WCS. I think we should always strive for that. So the second topic I would like to cover is the criteria for success. The goals of introducing SMART obviously vary from situation to situation, but usually there are these type of goals. You would like to have good and consistent high quality monitoring data from the patrols that you can use for management. You would like, with improving that management, then eventually achieve a substantial improvement in probably the volume and the quality of your patrols. You want to achieve that the resources that are available to sites, which are always limited, that are efficiently in an optimal way used. And you would like to eventually, with SMART, get poaching and other illegal resource use under control. And hopefully this would lead to an increase in population of conservation species. And what is actually also usually a goal of introducing SMART, or maybe a very nice side effect, is that sponsors like it. When SMART has been introduced, it provides a certain transparency. You can show what you've been doing, how you address problems, and that is a useful tool for attracting sponsors. You can put this in a kind of hierarchy. When can you call the introduction of SMART successful? Well, the first level of success, very basically, is when you have consistent, good monitoring data coming in that are useful for patrol management. Then with those data, you should set up what is called adaptive management. And you should use the data at least at 3 levels. When a patrol comes in with data, assuming that you don't have SMART connected, to have the data on their phone, there should be patrol debriefing. Just checking what they have done, checking if the quality of the data is good, discussing the patrol and the patrol events, see if there's some immediate action that is required. This is the first level of using data. Then the most important level is that there should be regular periodic reports written that you use for an assessment of the quality of the patrols and for managing them and setting targets. And then eventually, I think there should also be something like annual in-depth analysis. I'll talk about that later. Well, all of this, the introduction, what you want to achieve is then a step-by-step improvement of patrol quality. So things like a larger volume and better focus of patrols, and maybe also better coverage of the area where it is patrolled, but maybe also better coverage in time, like more early morning or night patrols. Of course, this depends on what you consider to be good quality patrolling that you would like to achieve. Eventually, of course, you would like to get illegal resource use, like poaching, under control. And eventually, of course, that's why we all do it. You would like to achieve your conservation goals, your targets, like protecting or increasing the local population of snow leopards and their prey species, and good protection of their habitats, obviously. So this is kind of hierarchy. 1, 2, and 3 depends on how good you introduce SMART. There's not so many, not a lot of money involved needed to do that. But whether you get poaching under control and achieve your conservation goals, that of course also depends on other factors, not directly related to SMART, like the resources you have available for that are available for patrolling, and the level of the threats, and things like the law enforcement rights and the skills of the quality of the rangers, of the patrol staff. So these are things as an implementer of SMART that you usually don't really have control over. Well, what are requirements for a successful introduction of SMART as I just defined? These are a few basic things that are obviously needed. You need the hardware, like mobile phones for using smart mobile. You need a computer to run smart on. There are some costs involved with that. They should be covered. And you need involvement from site staff, at least at 3 levels, both the field staff that will be collecting data in the field, data operators. There should be somebody eventually that takes over the work with the computer database, and site managers. I'll talk about these roles in more detail later. And it's obviously good if all relevant stakeholders are involved, are glad that SMART is being implemented, and participates and commits to the process. This is also something I'll talk about in more detail later. And if this is done for the first time somewhere, obviously there's somebody needed or a team needed with some experience with introducing SMART. They should have good technical skills, but probably most important is that they should have also good management skills. So one thing you might wish to start with is to do a suitability assessment. Just try to assess if the site where you want to, or the agency where you want to introduce SMART, is suitable, and whether the situation well, is such that you can expect success. So why would you like to do that? Well, maybe if you're in a position to, if you assess the situation and you think there are very few chances of being successful, you might decide not to do it. So maybe you're in a position where you can still take a go, no-go decision. But even if it's already decided that SMART will be introduced, I think it's still useful to do something like an overall assessment of the situation in which you will work. And for such an assessment, these are my suggestions. I know that there are certain formats that have been developed for suitability assessments. My suggestion would be is to look at all of them and see if there are things that are useful, but eventually develop your own set of criteria for to assess the situation. And I suggest to group the indicators that you think are relevant into something like at least 4 categories. First, which is obvious, is biodiversity. Basically, ask yourself the question, is there biodiversity that is worth protecting? And that's also maybe requires SMART to improve the protection. That can be in a situation where there is a really high level of biodiversity, a substantial population of target species, for instance, like snow leopard, snappers, but that are under threat, that require additional protection. Or a situation where biodiversity has really been degraded, has really suffered from illegal resource use, but still has a good potential for recovery. Then I think you should create something like a set of factors that are important, but are not under your control during the project. I'll give some examples later. And then also things that you might try to change before you start or in the process. So things that you have at least some control over in the situation where you work. And then as a 4th point there, I think you should also assess your own capacity, the capacity of your team or the capacity of the NGO that is supporting this process, whoever is carrying it out. They should have sufficient skills and capacity to do the job. I think you should also assess the overall difficulty to achieve a change in the management style of the site, from a situation where there's no SMART to a situation where SMART is fully functional as an adaptive management tool. And as I mentioned, there are three categories, three groups of site staff that are important. You should assess them all and see whether you can expect problems there or whether you think their capacity is good. And you may wish to make a kind of overview like this one. So there first is the biodiversity to see if that is worthwhile. And then two are things, the situation in which you are working, but you cannot control them. And three are situations mostly related to the site that maybe you can even change a little bit before you start or during the process. And the fourth is, well, basically the team that you work with. And you basically, well, think of all the factors that you think are important and define them. And they're either positive in the green or they're negative in the red. And when the situation, which is, well, mostly under 2 and 3 is difficult, then hopefully you've got a lot of capacity in your team to compensate for those difficulties and to be able to cope with them. So as a general rule, if the situation is difficult, then you should be ready to be involved for a long time, to do a lot, to give a lot of support, and maybe for years to carry out certain tasks that the local site doesn't have a really good capacity for, like in-depth analysis, which is usually one of the most difficult things. There are little bits, I use a few terms that are from derived from a management tool, which is called change management or management of change. Terms like a sponsor, a change agent, an advocate are terms you probably heard. They come from that management science. And one of the important things from that perspective that I've learned to do is to make an overall assessment of the difficulty of the change that you want to achieve. Basically, SMART is about changing the way protection is organized, is managed at a protected area. Well, protection is usually the core activity of a protected area, that's obvious. And it's always difficult to change core activities of organizations. So you should make a kind of general assessment. And what is most important there is that if things have been organized for a long time without SMART and the managers are pretty old and experienced in the way of doing it without SMART, they usually find it very difficult to change their management practices and start using SMART in an efficient way. So that is an important part of your assessment. Usually when the managers are young and the protected area, for instance, has been just recently established, then basically you can almost start with SMART from the start and you don't need to change old habits. That is, in my experience, easier than a situation where there's an old and established site with older and experienced managers. So the next topic, the vision of SMART tasks. I think that's also a useful thing, and I would advise you to do something similar to this. You just make a list of all the things that need to be done, and then you make a list of the stakeholders, the organization that are involved. For instance, here, this is an example where there's an NGO asked to assist with introducing SMART. And the question was raised by the director of the site, and there are no other stakeholders involved. So you have got basically three organizations, two organizations involved, the NGO and the site, and you just map who is going to do what, and you make it dynamic. Like in the first year, the NGO provides a lot of support. But eventually you would like to see things become more and more green, because green here in this picture means that the site starts to carry out those tasks. And it's a useful figure, I think, to use for discussion with the other stakeholders involved, and agree on their role, and agree also that maybe in the beginning the NGO does a lot, helps with almost everything, but eventually they should know what their tasks should be, and what they should be doing independently from support, and when you expect it from them. I think it's useful to agree on that at the start of your process. Now there's a group of topics that I kind of discuss together. Almost looks as though we're already halfway, which is good. I suggest when you introduce SMART to clearly distinguish between two phases in the introduction, and that is first the introduction of SMART as a monitoring system, basically ensuring that on all patrols good quality data is always collected and stored in the database and ready to be analyzed. So that's basically something I suggest you focus on in the beginning. And then not yet carry out the adaptive management components of the process. You should already prepare everybody. Everybody should be aware that that is your ultimate goal. That's introducing just monitoring, has no use, doesn't make sense, but you shouldn't implement it for starters. So focus on the monitoring aspects in the beginning, because it's very important when you start managing on using the SMART data that the data are good and reliable. And basically you shouldn't use the data at all until there are still problems with the data. So you should focus on that. And also the whole system, the monitoring system, should be well tested, so that you're really satisfied with it at a certain point, and then start using the data. Because if you later on still want to make changes and there are already data in the database, you have basically a problem. So when you start managing, you should be certain that you're satisfied with the monitoring. So what are the steps in introducing SMART protection monitoring? There are many ways you can do it. If you want to do it very thoroughly and you have a good capacity, then my suggestion is to do it in this way. Take the 10 steps that are included here. I will go through them one by one. The first step is to assess the present protection practices. And I think it's a good idea, if you're an outsider, to really meet with everybody, sit down, get to know all the people involved, even all the rangers and the team leaders and the managers and the director. Consider joining a few patrols and really take your time for this process. What are you going to assess? What is the kind of information that you need to make decisions about the design of your monitoring system? Well, obviously, there are the simple things that you need to program SMART, like the names of the teams, the names of the inspectors, the stations, the patrol stations, the ranks that are used, the organizations that are involved, that it's not only the sites, the transport types, the patrol types. That is basically things that you have to have lists of, and you use them to design, to program SMART. You should also really understand very well how patrols are organized in the site where you start working. That's a topic I'll discuss in my next slide. And I think you should understand what rangers do. Usually they do much more than just law enforcement patrolling. They're very often also involved in things like forestry work, firefighting, work with camera traps, transit counts, etc. And you might wish to have a SMART system where you know how much time is spent on these various activities. Even if you have a data model that only involves protection data categories. because it's obvious when a patrol team goes out and does some forestry work, they're less effective in catching violators. So you have to know how much the difference is in the effectiveness from a patrol perspective when they do different kinds of types of work. For instance, if you have a situation where you see that the patrol results go down, and you also know that law enforcement patrolling is much more effective in catching poachers than, for instance, in forestry work, and you see in your SMART database that the amount of time they spend on forestry work goes up, then you already have an explanation for why the patrol results are going down. Obviously, you need to understand all the violation and threat types that the patrols address at the site. And of course, the actions that rangers take in various situations. For instance, if they issue warnings or only citations, what kind of equipment is being confiscated, etc. And you should understand the present monitoring practices. What kind of information do rangers collect about their patrol work, and how do they report back to their managers? Obviously, your SMART system should reflect that. So the system that was there, that everything that is important to the managers is also included in your SMART system. And have a look, investigate how the management practices are. Usually there are meetings between the managers and their rangers. If possible, join a meeting and see what kind of topics are discussed and what kind of questions the managers ask. And that might give you some additional understanding of what would be good to include in the data model. And then there are various materials that are helpful for the design process. Usually protected areas have to make annual reports to the ministry, have a look on what topics, what kind of results they have to report on, both results and efforts, and ensure that SMART covers that. Very often there are certain databases, for instance, a database of previous violators. Just see what is kept in those databases and see if there is feedback to the rangers in the field. If they, for instance, have a laptop or an overview of previous violators. So if they come across people or a car, a vehicle in the field, that they can look up if that was involved in the violation previously. If there's no such system, it's good to arrange it and to discuss it and to ensure that SMART collects the data that is needed for that feedback. Rangers usually at the end of their patrols have to write a patrol report, have a look at those reports and see what information is included there. And very often it's possible with SMART then basically to abolish this whole ranger patrol report system, because basically the data that they collect during the patrol is a form of reporting. And this is also when you can achieve that, of course, something that the rangers would really appreciate, because it makes their work simpler. Also, very often you can find interesting information on the website. So, of course, there are any information that you can find that you think might be useful can be added to this. This is kind of basic list. And one thing that I would like to advise is to try to improve the patrol system before you introduce SMART, if there's a necessity. It's interesting, in the former Soviet Union, there are two completely opposite patrol systems that have been evolved. One system is where all the rangers have a really small area for which they are responsible, and they have to walk fixed routes, And there's a big focus on biological and especially on phenological monitoring, what is called the Chronicles of Nature, or Letopis in Russian. And in those situations, very often they get strict instructions. They know exactly what they need to do on a daily basis. But this is not an optimal situation. In my experience with SMART, the most progress that you achieve in patrol quality is when protection is organized like this. So there are teams and not individual rangers that are responsible for specific areas. Those teams, they should be working in really large areas. It's also good if those areas that are allocated to specific teams overlap, so they can, well, they basically unexpectedly bump into each other. So there's also an element of the teams checking on each other. It's good when the teams, the rangers really feel part of a team, and to achieve that, it's desirable that they don't switch between teams, so that the teams have a fixed composition. I think it's also good if rangers never patrol alone. Basically, well, because it's dangerous and they might be scared to act when there's a situation that involves risk when they're alone. And there's also an element of some social control. I think if you want to prevent corruption, I think it's better if people do not work alone. There are situations where teams or inspectors receive instructions on a day-to-day basis, exactly where they should go, what they should do, and when. And in my experience, SMART works better if the teams have a high level of independence. If they themselves decide on which day they're going to spend on repairing their vehicle and which day they're going on patrol. So they're responsible for their own transport needs, and they are responsible to decide when and where they do patrolling. When all this will be monitored with SMART, you simply set targets for them, and they should implement them on a monthly or 2 monthly basis or something like that. That is better. That creates a higher level of feeling of responsibility, and for the development of skills and rangers that feel confident and take initiative, which I think is all what is needed. It helps when they have a high level of independency. And in Russia, almost always there's what is called a mobile or operational team, operativna Gruppe in Russian, who operates in the whole site. So basically, one of their tasks is also to control, check on the activities of the other teams. And in Russia, it's even usually organized like this, that all the teams fall under the Deputy Director for Protection, with the exception of 1 or 2 of those mobile teams that operate everywhere, who are the direct responsibility of the director. So basically, there's then also a kind of mechanism where the director has its own people basically to monitor the quality of the work of the Deputy Director. So I would advise, if you come into a system that looks very different from this, to try if there's a possibility to change it into a system as described here before you start with SMART. Now, what kind of data categories are usually included in patrol data models? Well, I've written them down. It's quite obvious, of course. Usually there's some kind of distinction between situations where violators have been apprehended and situations where only signs of violations or other general threats, doesn't necessarily have to be a violation, are observed. course, there's a category of various confiscations that can be poached items or equipment, even transport means, weapons. And for instance, in national parks, there usually the data model is usually more complicated than in a strict reserve, and it usually also includes various legal activities of visitors, or activities that at least could be legal if they have the required permits for this, like maybe grazing, anti-FP collection. Very often visitors can get permits for fishing. Well, these activities have to be checked by rangers, and well, checking that is often included in the data model. And observations related to key wildlife species, for instance, snow leopards. Well, these are a number of considerations that I advise to take into account when you design your data model. Of course, it sounds obvious, the data that are being collected should be valuable for management. You should be able to use them to improve things. Sounds obvious, but very often things like earthquakes or tsunamis or storms or all kinds of things that are completely, that cannot be controlled in any way, are included in the data model. And I would argue that unless there are really good reasons to do so, you better not include this kind of data. My advice is to keep it really simple and to ensure that data collection doesn't take up more than 5% of the patrol time. And in many situations, it is even possible to have that close to 0%. Basically, the person who is responsible for collecting data picks on the phone while the patrol team just continues moving. And in many situations, if you keep the data model simple, there's hardly any time spent. The patrol very rarely has to stop. It's important to check if the rangers have the required skills to collect the data that you ask them to collect. To give an example, if you ask them to document visual observation of golden eagles and black vultures, then this only makes sense if you're sure that the rangers have the capacity, the skills to distinguish black vultures from golden eagles. If not, you have to do additional training. Obviously, you should take the ranger morale and discipline into account. If there's low morale and discipline, you should keep the system really, really very simple. You could even decide to have a simple system where you only ask them to collect data for SMART on citations and confiscations. If they happen regularly, that could be a good start. If you think if you ask them to collect more, that will be problematic, and that might result in, over time, the quality of data collapsing because rangers get tired of all the data collection that they have to do. In a situation like that, it's better to keep it really, really simple. And it also helps to think of what other sources you have for your data available besides patrols. For instance, if you ask teams to assess the level of encroachment, maybe that can be monitored much better with satellite imagery. So always consider if you have other and better sources of information in your patrols. And if that's the case, don't ask patrol teams to collect data on that. That is especially true for wildlife monitoring. If there's a good science department and there are, for instance, transect counts on a regular basis and camera trap monitoring, then maybe it's not even necessary that patrol teams that should focus on law enforcement also collect data on biological data. You might decide to have, for instance, something like have the rangers do transact counts once a month, and then the rest of the months they don't need to collect any biological data. That's an option you should consider. In any case, I often think data collection becomes very tiresome for rangers if you include monitoring of ungulates, and especially ungulate tracks, because they usually come across them all the time, and that makes data collection very tiresome for them. And obviously the last point is SNART already operates somewhere in the country, and especially in the similar landscape. Have a look at those data models, and if possible, use almost identical models, especially in the same landscape with the same type of problems and wildlife. Something that's I've got the impression that is sometimes forgotten when you design a smart system. You really have to spend time on designing all the procedures for data collection in order to ensure that there's consistency in the way data are collected, that they're standardized data, meaning that there's no difference between patrol teams, between managers, or different time periods in the way how data are collected. What I mean with the type of procedures that you have to define, I'll give a few examples here. Like obviously you have to decide where data collection starts. For instance, if you have a road around a protected area, but it's not part of the protected area, is traveling on that road, should it be included or not? You might decide that it's good to include it because maybe observations, violators going into the protected area can be observed from that road. So it makes sense to patrol on that road. And if that makes sense, then have a procedure that defines that once you're on that road, data collection should already start. Questions like whether short rest periods of 10 minutes or 50 minutes or half an hour, etc., when they should be collected. And what to do if a team splits up, if it's always necessary, in which situations that both groups then collect data for SNART. Very often site staff work together with other agencies, and then you should decide how that is included in SNART, and whether, for instance, the protocols, the citations that are issued by another agency are then also documented by the site staff for SNART. Things like whether a single ranger is allowed to go on patrol and then collect data for SNART. It should also be decided. A situation where an observation is reported to a team, but they haven't, they go out, but they can't see the observation, they can't find it. Should they then include it in SNART or not? And in what way? And there should also, if you're not working with SNART Connect, be defined procedures on how to hand in your photos. There should be maybe a specific day for that, or some kind of system that the protection manager and the data operator are at the office at that moment, so they can do patrol debriefing. Well, there are many, many other procedures that have to be defined, and for many of them it's not so important how you define them, but that they are defined. They should be defined so that teams and individual rangers don't develop a personal approach to data collection. How it's done should be defined in a way, in a collective way, so everybody does it in the same way. I advise, when you've done your assessment and you considered everything and you made your decisions as a person or as a team on what the monitoring system should look like, that you describe it in a Word document, and that you solicit feedback on that from all the stakeholders. And based on that, that feedback, you can improve the system and then finalize it. So what could be the content of such a document describing the system that you propose? I think it should include a short introduction so that everybody understands what SMART is and what the project is within, well, where SMART is being introduced. Some main of the results from the assessments, kind of short description of how the protection system operates in the situation where you want to introduce SMART. It should describe some general principles for data collection, like that it should be done honestly and consistent and accurate, etc. You can make something like a short list of the things that rangers should take with them when they go out on a patrol, what is needed for SMART data collection, and then describe all the data collection components, the data model, the patrol attributes that are collected at the start of the patrol, and the data collection procedures, protocols that I just gave a number of examples for. And you might already wish to upload it on SMART and give a few screenshots on how these procedures for data collection look on a phone. And some suggestions on how data logistics, bringing the data back to the office so that it can be uploaded into the database, how that will be organized. Well, this is, I think, a useful overview, I hope, for what to include in such a document that you can share with all stakeholders to get feedback and to ensure that you design a system that they really like and that is really tailor-made for the situation in which you work. So when you have done that, you optimize the system based on the feedback that you get. If you don't get feedback from some important stakeholders, you should really pursue them and ensure that you get their opinion. Maybe arrange an additional meeting and sit down with them and just go through the documents page by page together with them if they find it difficult to write down their feedback. And then, of course, you should finalize the programming the SMART data model on a phone. In the SMART computer program, and then install it on the phones that will be, or at least one that will be used for data collection. And then test that data collection. Before you start working with the rangers, you should be sure that everything works well. The computer that will be used and the phones, that they work together well without any technical problems. Already covered that. So now about the training workshops. When you've designed your system, of course, you have to train all the stakeholders, all the three groups, the rangers, the data operator, and the managers in using this system. So there are these three types of trainings that have to be conducted. Well, to start with the data collection trainings, well, in general, I think it's important to make them enjoyable. The rangers should not start to dislike SMART. It would be good to have at least something like 3 presentations involved, and that is an introduction on SMART, how it operates worldwide, how SMART operates. It has been already introduced in similar sites. It would be really good to give examples from the data analysis and the management decisions that are based on that from other sites. And well, an outdoor training materials for that should be prepared. I'll talk about that in more detail later. And all the rangers should get a personal copy of a data collection manual, basically a document that describes all the procedures for data collection with screenshots from smartphones. A possible program for such a training could look like this. So a word of welcome from the site director, maybe an NGO representative, and hopefully there's also participation of a central agency. All of them maybe could say a few words at the start of the meeting. And very often SMART, the introduction of SMART is part of a larger program, for instance, the UNDP, the GEF program or something else. If there are more, if that's the case, if there's a larger program, it will be a really good opportunity to discuss that and to talk about that. Then a general introduction of what is SMART, introduce the SMART partnership, give examples of how SMART is used in Africa and other parts of Asia, give examples of data analysis. So everybody starts to understand what SMART really is. And then make a presentation where you basically cover all the main chapters from the data collection manual that you've made. And then go out on an outdoor exercise. I'll talk about that later. Then during that outdoor exercise, you ask the rangers to practice with data collection, and then when they come back to the workshop venue, you upload those data into the database and you check them and discuss it with the rangers who have collected that data, and try to, if they made any mistakes, try to address them and explain how those mistakes can be corrected. And then, of course, at the end of the training, there should be a discussion of the next step. The next main step, and I'll talk about it later, is a test period. After the test period, the results of the test period will be evaluated, and if everything turned out to be going well, then SMART can be launched. I mean, then also the adaptive management components. And it's good to have a really nice closing ceremony with handing out good-looking certificates. About this outdoor exercise, this is an example for something that could be done in snow leopard habitat. Basically, you make a list of observations that can be encountered in the field. Somebody has to switch over this microphone. And some details of each observation type, and you this is a handout that every ranger that will practice data collection gets. And basically what you ask to do then is to walk small routes, and along that route they see those pictures. You put them up to trees or walls or whatever, and then they have to document the observation with all the details that are on this handout. And it's also possible to have a training where you cover not only SMART, but also some additional patrol skills. I made a list of here of the things that you could cover. If you do only a SMART training, I think one day is sufficient. If you involve these kind of topics in your training, and very often that is useful, then I think you have a 2-day training. Well, something, the main messages for rangers, I later have an overview for all stakeholders, but I think the main thing is that they should not dislike data collection. If you organize it in a fun way, they will have the very often get the idea that data collection is not difficult and might even be fun. And here an example of a training certificate that Tony made for a SMART introduction workshop for 3 days that we held, I think already 3 years ago in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek. The next phase is next type of training that I want to discuss is training staff in the use of the SMART computer program. It could be useful because that is quite a lot of work. That involves much more than just 1 day. To split that up into 3 stages, 3 levels. First, the skills that they need for their work during the test period. So you basically introduce the main modules of the SMART program. You explain how the module is installed on smart phones, and how they can share, for instance, with the NGO staff, backups of the system, so that they can also have a look at the data that has come in. And I think at this stage, as far as data processing is concerned, that could be limited to the processing of data that is needed for debriefing. So making a simple map of where the patrol has gone, and a table showing how many days they were working on each day, and how many kilometers they traveled with different types of transport types. And you can already work out those queries and put them in a separate folder called patrol debriefing. So basically what the data operator has to do in the beginning when data comes in is just analyze them with the queries that are in the folder of the patrol debriefing folder. So he has something that he can show to the protection manager for assessing the quality of the patrol during debriefing. The next level is to prepare the data operators for producing this periodic patrol reports. Obviously, they'll need more skills for that. And then eventually they should reach a level where they can do more complicated in-depth analysis, and maybe even, although that is quite difficult, use the reporting tool in SMART. Well, now the third type of training, and that is training adaptive management, teaching the managers that are going to use the SMART data, how to do that in an effective way. Basically, how to set up adaptive patrol management based on SMART data. I suggest that this is kind of an informal process. You just sit down, maybe not just one meeting, but several meetings with the protection managers, and you try them to understand what eventually will be required from them. And to prepare them, it's helpful to show analysis from other sites and the kind of management decisions that were made based on those analysis. And discuss the necessity for patrol debriefing and discuss with them how this can be organized to ensure that basically what is needed for that is that a database operator and a patrol manager are available at the moment when the ranger team comes back from patrol. Discuss how the periodic feedback meetings will look like, what will be discussed there, give examples, show examples of the feedback reports that are produced at other sites, and discuss who will lead the first feedback meeting. It's optimal when a protection manager from the site leads the meeting, but sometimes they don't feel comfortable with doing this, and then it might be in the beginning something like a shared process, like both the deputy director and people from the SMART introduction team conduct the meeting, lead the meeting. And what I think is important is before you start collecting data and assessing the data that come in, to have something like an agreement, what you consider to be good patrol quality, and to define that in a relative way. I'll explain what I mean by that. So what I suggest is not to define the patrol quality that you want to achieve in absolute terms, like the number of hours, the number of kilometers that will be traveled, etc., but in relative terms, like what percentage of the patrol should visit the northern part, which percentage of the patrol should visit the southern part, etc. How much of the total patrol time should teams spend on foot patrols, and how much on vehicle patrols, how much on horse patrols, etc. Which percentage of patrols should be during the night or in the early morning? And how should the annual patrol effort be divided over the seasons? Is there a season when patrolling is more important, or a season when patrolling is maybe very, very difficult, so that reduces the patrol volume? You should agree on all those kind of factors. Something like, for instance, how deep should patrols penetrate into the protected area? How far should they go from roads? Those kind of things. Well, anything you might think is relevant, it's good to define that in advance. And why do that in a kind of percentage way? That's basically obviously because you don't have data on the volume that's of the patrols before you have introduced SMART, so you don't know the volume. So you can't, and then it's even risky to set an absolute number, because it might be much too high, and then it might be discouraging, or it might be much too low, then it's too easy to achieve that, and then everybody will say, oh, we already have good patrol. So better in the beginning define everything in relative terms. But it's important to do it before you start collecting data, because my experience is if you don't do it, then a manager will look at the data that come in and he'll claim that everything is perfect, that nothing really needs to be changed. So to avoid that, that they become a little bit lazy, don't want to improve things, therefore it's a good idea to define quality at least before you start. Well, here an overview of the main messages that I think you should get across to the three main groups that receive training. It's very, very important that the rangers understand that if they don't collect data on all the patrols, then basically the whole system doesn't work. They are the kind of foundation of everything. For data operators, I find it important that they don't work as robots. They should really try to check the data and try to find mistakes. And they should continuously, well, intensively work with the database and always try to find something interesting in the data. When they find something, share it proactively with the managers, not just wait until managers ask them to show data. Most difficult usually is to get managers to start really using the data well and start in an effective adaptive management way. They should understand that they should change their old habits. And sometimes it can be really, really difficult. I had a situation in Russia with a protected area with a really somewhat older director a few years before his pension, who found patrolling really the most important activity of his strict reserve, who met weekly with all the patrol team leaders, and always started those meetings with, well, tell me what you've done last week. And I explained to him that he should go to the data operator and before the meeting have everybody hand in their data and let the data operator make a simple overview of the work that was done by each team in the last week. And basically, we were never able to get him to do that. So sometimes it is really, really difficult to change the habits of managers. After the training of rangers has been completed, it's important to start the next day with what I call a monitoring test period. From that moment onwards, all the teams should always collect data on all their patrols. And basically, you test the quality of the data collection, and you test the discipline of the rangers, whether there are any technical problems with the phones. You should test whether debriefing is really being conducted for all the patrols that return from their patrols. Basically, you should test your whole system. That also means that you should solicit feedback on the system from the rangers that work with the system. For instance, whether they come across relevant things that they observe during patrols, but that are not included in the data model. You should get some idea on how much time the ranger spends on data collection, and whether they liked it or not. And something about the data manual that you prepared for them. Is everything explained in the manual clearly? Do they have any suggestions for improvements? Well, basically what you set out to do during the test period is to find any kind of kinks in the system, things that still require improvement. And then during the test period evaluation, you should ask yourself, well, these kind of questions. One of the things I always do is compare the number of patrols that are in the SNART database with the patrols that are documented in the previous, in the old traditional protected area administration system. And if there are patrols still conducted that didn't collect data for SNART, then basically you can't launch SNART with the management components. Then you should focus on solving this problem first. Well, you should see if there were any technical problems and solve them all. You should assess if debriefing was conducted for all patrols. If there are any changes needed in the data model, you better do that now at the end of the test period before the management components are being developed. Well, whether those data collection procedures that I discussed are working well, and whether the manual needs any edits, and based on your evaluation of the test period, you might decide that a little bit of additional ranger data collection training is needed. Sometimes everything goes perfect during the test period, and then after a month or so, you can already decide that data collection is good enough to really start using the data for adaptive management. So one of the things that you also should decide when you end the test period and start the adaptive management procedures, whether the data that were collected during the test period were good enough to already keep them in the database and use them for evaluation. So now about when you've launched SNART, the adaptive management, main components of that should be regular feedback reports and feedback meetings. Well, some things about the feedback reports. I like it to make a presentation, a PowerPoint presentation, well, basically with slides that you can present to the rangers, and just a version, of course, on the computer that the manager can use for his evaluation of patrol quality. The contents should be both the patrol efforts and the patrol results, and if patrol targets have been met. And assessing the patrol targets and whether they have been met, and how, there should be some decision on draft targets for the next period that can at least be discussed with the rangers, and then at the end of the meeting decided and agreed upon. There should be information, especially on the efforts at 3 levels: at the ranger level, team level, and the level of the whole site. And as much as possible, this is obviously not possible for the first report, but eventually, as much as possible, compare the reporting period with the previous periods. And when you've got more than 1 year data, also compare the reporting period with the same periods in the previous year. So basically, you always like to see what the trends are, if the trends are up or down, and focus on trends means that you have to compare with previous periods. Now about feedback meetings with rangers where this patrol report is being discussed. I think it's important to have all relevant stakeholders there. So if there's a local NGO involved and an international NGO, they should both be present. In the beginning, it's really good if there, or maybe always, there's also a person from the central agency. It's often a good idea to ask team leaders to present their own patrol work. So make something like 2 or 3 slides summarizing the efforts and results of each individual team, and then invite the team leaders to comment on the work that they've done in the previous period. It's a good idea to focus on patrol targets. Did the teams meet them? And if not, ask them why they were not met, and discuss targets for the next period. I think it's important to really discuss it and to have the team leaders give them a say in the whole process, so everybody is behind the targets that are eventually agreed upon. And in my experience, it is optimal if the protection manager leads these meetings, but not always he has the skills to do this effectively. So you might end up with a situation where, for instance, the database operator who is very familiar with the data leads these meetings. That is already somewhat suboptimal. In some situations, somebody from the NGO staff will have a big role in these meetings. That is also not optimal. And also the problem is that as long as NGO staff needs to do this, the system isn't independent from outside support. At some point, you have to decide what the duration is of the adaptive management main cycle, like whether you have reports produced and meetings conducted monthly or 2 monthly or maybe even weekly or quarterly. I think this decision is best taken on the basis of the experience with producing a first report and meeting, and especially on how quick when the data are complete for the previous month. For instance, if you have a situation where you would like to do monthly reports, but it's really difficult to have all the data from all the teams in the database before the 10th of the month. That means that 1/3 of the month is already gone. So in a situation like that, it's better than to have 2 months report, or maybe even quarterly reports. Now, well, quickly, some of the data that can be shown in periodic reports. This is an overview of patrols by different teams and compared for different years. So basically you compare April this year with April previous year. This is an example of graphs that can be made of patrol efforts. For instance, distance of foot patrols and distance of motorized patrols by various teams in various months in 2 years that you compare. Another example, how much time is spent by different teams in different months on various types of patrols. This is something that I started to do in a few protected areas in Russia after noticing that some teams start after lunch and some teams are willing to do a lot of early morning patrols. So we basically started to monitor when the first patrol of a day starts. So for instance, in this in October, the North team conducted 24 patrol days, of which 3 patrols started before 6 o'clock in the morning. So basically you can set targets then for early morning patrols, for instance, and night patrols, and then see if they were met. And it's also possible to make something like a graph on the right side, basically to see how activities are spread over the 24 hours of the day. Some directors prefer tables over graphs. This is, for instance, a table of patrol efforts of a small reserve with only 2 teams. So for each team, the inspectors are listed, and you can see how many kilometers they walked, how many kilometers they drove, how many kilometers in other types of transport means, and how much time they spent on active patrols and on non-active patrols, which is roadblocks. And in this strict reserve, it's also this information collected on how much time they spend at the station. Basically, they're not patrolling then, but they're away from home. So basically it's work, and therefore it makes sense to collect that data. This is another example of a protected area where the teams had what I told is optimal, a high level of independence. But as a result, not every team took it seriously, and many teams didn't want to work in the weekends. So the weekends are marked red here, and in the beginning, the weekends were much more yellow, which means that they had a rest day than the other days. And basically making this table and saying, guys, you also have to work in the weekend, then you can monitor if they do that. There should be something like a table with various patrol results of the various groups per month. This is an example where there are citations and confiscations and initiated criminal prosecution cases and all the observations related to leopards and tigers included in the database, included in the report. Maybe not every report, but every now and then you can make a kind of overview on how much time is spent on the different types of patrolling. And what kind of citations are being produced. And this is same protected area where they had a schedule of 3 months, the quarterly in-depth patrol reports. And in addition to those in-depth reports, they make a 2-page monthly report. And that is not discussed with rangers, but it's only produced for the manager in order to see if the teams are on track. with carrying out their targets. So basically, this is the first page. It shows for each team how much time and the distance traveled for different types of patrols. And there's a map of the food patrols. It's on this map. And then there's a map of all the patrol transport types for all the teams. So basically, just a 2-page monthly report, in addition to something like a 40-page quarterly report. So these were some examples of periodic reports. In Russia, at many sites, WCS operates a Ranger Awards system. I would like to briefly discuss that with you and show an example. There are basically two options. One is a system like this, where you divide a fixed sum, for instance, $500 in this case, over 2 teams based on their relative performance. So the total is fixed, but the division between the 2 teams depends on how a team performed relative to the other team. And there are 2 categories: patrol efforts and patrol results. Well, basically a very simple system. And you can, of course, put in any criteria that you find relevant. It's no problem if you change the criteria every now and then. You can also give weights to the various criteria and change the weights to reflect, for instance, changes in the patrol priorities and the targets that teams receive. In general, there are 2 options for award bonus system. That is something like a fixed total. I just showed an example of that. And the other option is a price list. Basically, for 10 kilometers walked, they get a certain amount of money. The latter, this price list, means that the total is unpredictable. So you have to be a little bit careful with how much money you promise for each effort or result unit. In general, I think you should only start a bonus system if there's really a problem with Ranger morale, and if their salaries are really low and you have financial means to provide substantial bonuses, and you are certain that you can finance that long term, because it's very detrimental. It's obviously a very bad effect on Ranger morale when a bonus system is abolished. But it has something like a negative impact also on morale, a little bit like bankers' bonuses. The Rangers find out whatever system you make, they find out what is the easiest way to get the highest bonuses. And what is easy doesn't really always mean that it's the best patrol quality. So I think you should only have a bonus system if there's really a problem with Ranger morale. Something like maybe a prize for the best Ranger for each period is also a really good idea, and in many situations preferable. Well, as I said, I think it's a good idea to do some in-depth analysis annually. If possible, if you have somebody who can work with ArcMap, ArcGIS, to do really in-depth analysis, for instance, correlations between where patrols find violators and how far that is on average from roads or villages, etc. This kind of analysis that cannot be done they can't be done in SNART, but you can export the data to ArcMap and do that there. But I don't have the skills to do that. If there's somebody who can offer that, that would be great. I show some examples of analysis that can be done with the SNART program. For instance, an overview in various years of the patrol coverage in a protected area. What is also interesting is to analyze differences in the effectiveness of various patrols. For instance, at this particular site, but it's usually true for all sites in Russia, is that vehicle patrols are effective if you want to catch trespassers, just simple tourists, basically. But if you want to catch poachers, foot patrols are much more effective, like almost twice as effective as vehicle patrols. It's also good over the years to have a look at the performance of individual rangers. This is a slide that shows the average monthly patrol time, the percentage of patrol time that was spent on foot patrols, and the distance of foot patrols. Just 3 indicators. You can choose any indicator. And then with data for 5 years. So you can see that most rangers started to perform better and better. You can also look at individual groups and just see if they go up or down. That's what I tried here with an example of one group in a protected area. And in the top, there are certain indicators for patrol efforts, and in the bottom, patrol results. And the picture doesn't look really good. If you, for instance, look at the percentage of patrol time that was spent on foot patrols, which is really important, that's kind of halved over a period of 4 years. And the problems basically started at the moment that the leader of this group, Quain, who was a really good leader, and as a result of his that he was such a good guy, he became deputy for protection. So he left this group, and after that, basically the quality of the he left the group in 2012, and after that you can see that quality went down until in 2015, based on the basis of SMART data, the patrol, this team leader was fired, and after that the quality of this group recovered. Well, basically, you should only look at the 2 pages, the slides, pictures on the right. The one in the middle gives you an absolute, the violations in absolute terms. So if something is dark blue, that means there were more violations uncovered there than it's areas that are yellow. When it's yellow, no violations were uncovered there. On the right is basically the same picture, only there it's a catch rate. So the number of violations per patrolled kilometer. And when things are, it makes sense that when certain blue squares are darker on the right than on the left, to put more patrol focus on those areas. Because those are basically areas that you didn't visit that often, but when you visit them, relatively often you bumped into a violator. So they deserve more attention. So this is one way to optimize your patrol focus using SMART. What you eventually want to achieve is something like this. In the most successful protected area where we've been working with SMART in the Russian Far East, we saw an enormous increase in patrol efforts, followed by, in the first year, also an enormous increase in results, like confiscated firearms, citations for poaching, other citations. They were all, on average, something like 3 times higher in the first year that SMART started than they were on average in the 3 years previous to the introduction of SMART. And then we saw a kind of collapse in the patrol results. Although the quality went up, the volume went up. The picture on the left shows only the volume, but also the quality went up in the sense that more night patrols were conducted, the coverage of the protected area improved, etc. So what the picture on the right shows, the patrol results per 1,000 patrol hours, that they went down that dramatically. Basically, in my opinion, means that poaching is now under control, this national park, which is in Russia relatively easy to achieve because there are really good poaching opportunities outside the protected areas. And the risks and the punishments are much higher in the protected area. So if you put something like reasonably good protection arranged, then the poachers will no longer risk to poach inside the protected areas, and then you can see these kind of dramatic decreases in poaching results. Now this is almost the end of the last slides. The possible roles for the central agency. As I already explained, in Russia there's hardly any role. They're hardly involved at all. That's obviously not a good situation. Here are six possible roles that the central agency could cover. And what I think is good for starters to engage with the central agency and to make them aware of what they could do to promote SMART and to make SMART successful at the sites where it has been introduced. And the most basic thing that they can obviously do is provide pay for the hardware that is required, but also for the database manager. Obviously, it would be good if they decide which protected area SMART could be introduced. And it is also helpful if they think over if they can set certain standards, for instance, for the data models, but also for what should be included in the reports. Well, for instance, the frequency of those reports, who should receive those reports, and what should be included in those reports. And they could also set some minimum criteria requirements for patrol quality. And what is really very important, it is good if there is a local capacity in the country for SMART. For instance, in Uzbekistan, the central authority appointed a SMART coordinator who's working closely with me on everything we do in a pilot project for 2 sites, with the aim that at the end of the project, he can manage SMART at those 2 sites without any outside help. And that he also develops the capacity to introduce SMART to additional sites without outside help. You can also point out that SMART is a really good management tool, not only at site level, but also at the central level. If they get those reports, these periodic reports and annual in-depth reports, it really gives a good picture of what is going on at the individual sites. And they could start to base their management decisions on those on SMART information. For instance, I think they should select for promotion directors and protection managers that have shown to improve the quality of protection after SMART was introduced. And yeah, eventually it's also a very good idea if they work towards national adoption of SMART as a standard tool. Okay, this is the last slide. For me, I think that to be successful, it's important that you look upon it, the introduction of SMART, as a difficult process of managing organizational change. So have a focus on that process to basically slowly coach all the stakeholders the managers, the data operators, the rangers from a situation that they don't use SMART into a situation where they start using it, into a situation where they start using it well, etc. And that's a difficult and slow process. I think you should take your time for that and be ready to be involved for at least 2 years. And my second advice is to keep the SMART system really simple. Usually, I think the systems that are designed are too complicated and therefore results in situations where data quality becomes poor after a while. So that was all I had to say. No idea how long it took me. I hope everything was clear. Was everything visible well?
Yes, Michael, that was really wonderful. I think that your presentation was very clear, and thank you for your very detailed presentation on how to set up SMART and what are the things that we need to think about if we're doing this for the first time. And I think that many of the people on the call today are people who are potentially considering setting up SMART for the first time. So I'm hoping now that some of our participants will have questions. So if it's all right with you, Justine, I'd like to open up for question time. So if there are questions for Michael, please either raise your hand or type into the chat, and we'll take questions for the next 10 to 15 minutes.